March 8, 1943, Willow Run Bomber Plant, Ypsilanti, Michigan. 06:17 hours. The production supervisor stopped counting at B-24 Fuselage Section 47, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of aluminum airframe components moving down assembly lines that stretched beyond visual range, inside a building so vast it generated its own weather patterns. Charlie Sorensen, Ford Motor Company vice president and the architect of mass production systems that had revolutionized automobile manufacturing, stood on an observation platform watching welders, riveters, and assemblers transform raw materials into bomber components at rates that aviation experts had declared impossible. One complete four-engine heavy bomber every 63 minutes from a factory that 18 months earlier had been farmland. What Sorensen didn't know was that he was witnessing the decisive weapon of World War II, not a new tank, not a secret bomb, not a brilliant strategy, but the capacity of American industry to manufacture war material on a scale that made Axis tactical superiority strategically irrelevant. Across the production floor, Rose Will Monroe, a 26-year-old riveter from Kentucky who had never touched an industrial tool before Pearl Harbor, positioned her pneumatic rivet gun against an aluminum wing panel and pulled the trigger, joining one of thousands of individual operations that, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of workers in thousands of factories, buried the Axis powers under an avalanche of production they couldn't match, couldn't stop, and ultimately couldn't survive. The American factory worker. No uniform, no weapon, no glory. But between 1941 and 1945, American industrial workers produced 297,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2.4 million trucks, 17 million rifles, 64,000 landing craft, and 6,500 naval vessels. Output that exceeded the combined production of Germany, Japan, and Italy by ratios approaching 3-to-1 in most categories, and representing industrial mobilization at speeds and scales unprecedented in human history. And it started with ordinary Americans who learned to operate machines, abandoned previous lives, and worked shifts that transformed the global balance of power one rivet at a time. The story begins not with factories, but with a fundamental miscalculation about American industrial capacity. December 1941, Tokyo, Imperial Headquarters. Japanese military planners, analyzing American industrial statistics and concluding that war with the United States was winnable, made calculations based on 1940 production data, which showed that American automobile plants were manufacturing approximately 4 million civilian vehicles annually. The analysis concluded that converting automotive production to military vehicles would require years, that American workers, accustomed to consumer goods manufacturing, lacked the discipline for military production, and that American society, soft from decades of prosperity, couldn't sustain the sacrifices total war required. German strategic assessments reached similar conclusions. Wehrmacht planning documents from 1940 noted American industrial capacity, but questioned whether democratic societies could mobilize effectively. The analysis concluded that American production would eventually pose challenges, but that Germany would achieve victory in Europe before American industrial mobilization reached operationally significant levels. Both assessments were catastrophically wrong, not because they misjudged American industrial capacity, the numbers were accurate, but because they misjudged the speed and totality of American industrial conversion from civilian to military production. The transformation began before Pearl Harbor. President Roosevelt, recognizing war was inevitable, initiated defense production expansion in 1940. The Arsenal of Democracy speech in December 1940 called for America to become the supplier of war material for nations fighting the Axis powers. Initial conversion was gradual. Automotive plants began producing trucks and aircraft engines for Britain while continuing civilian automobile production. Pearl Harbor eliminated gradualism. On December 7, 1941, civilian automobile production became strategically indefensible. Raw materials, factory capacity, and workers needed to produce tanks, aircraft, and ships couldn't be diverted to manufacturing consumer goods. Within weeks, automobile companies received orders to cease civilian production and convert entirely to military manufacturing. The conversion's speed shocked Axis intelligence agencies monitoring American production. Ford's River Rouge plant, the largest integrated factory in the world, stopped producing civilian automobiles in February 1942 and began producing aircraft engines, tanks, and military vehicles at the same facility. General Motors converted 50 factories from automobiles to tanks, aircraft, and munitions. Chrysler transformed plants producing luxury sedans into facilities manufacturing M3 tanks and anti-aircraft guns. But conversion speed was only part of the equation. The critical factor was that American automotive industry had already solved the fundamental problem of mass production: how to manufacture complex machines quickly using semi-skilled workers performing specialized tasks. Henry Ford had pioneered these techniques in manufacturing Model T automobiles. The assembly line principle, bringing work to the worker rather than workers to the work, enabled dramatic production acceleration. Specialized tools and fixtures allowed workers to perform specific tasks repeatedly without requiring comprehensive knowledge of the entire manufacturing process. Quality control systems caught defects early, preventing waste of materials and rework time. These techniques, developed for civilian manufacturing, translated directly to military production. A rivet gun operator installing automotive body panels could install aircraft fuselage rivets using identical techniques. A welder joining steel automobile frames could weld tank armor using similar equipment. An inspector verifying automobile engine tolerances could verify aircraft engine specifications using comparable measurement tools. What Axis planners failed to understand was that American industrial workers weren't learning new skills, they were applying existing skills to different products. Rose Will Monroe exemplified this transition. Before the war, Monroe had worked in various service jobs: waitress, beautician, taxi driver, with no manufacturing experience. In 1942, unemployed and supporting 2 daughters after her husband's death, she applied for work at Willow Run. Ford's training program taught her to operate a pneumatic rivet gun in approximately 40 hours. Within weeks, she was installing hundreds of rivets daily on B-24 Liberator bomber fuselages, performing work that required precision but not extensive education or specialized background. Monroe's experience was typical rather than exceptional. American factories employed millions of workers with minimal manufacturing experience, trained them in weeks rather than years, and achieved production rates that skilled craftsmen working traditional methods couldn't approach. The transition from craft production, where experienced workers manufactured complete items individually, to mass production, where semi-skilled workers performed specialized tasks on assembly lines, was the decisive industrial advantage America possessed. The numbers told the story. In 1940, the American aviation industry employed approximately 63,000 workers, manufacturing approximately 2,000 military aircraft annually. By 1944, aviation employment had increased to 2.1 million workers, manufacturing 96,000 military aircraft, a 48-fold production increase achieved primarily through workers who had never touched an aircraft before Pearl Harbor. Tank production demonstrated similar expansion. In 1940, American tank production totaled 331 units. In 1943, production peaked at 29,497 tanks, an 89-fold increase achieved by converting automotive factories and training automotive workers in tank assembly techniques. The critical insight was recognizing that modern warfare was industrial warfare, conflicts won by whichever side could produce more weapons, ammunition, and equipment faster than enemies could destroy them. German tanks might be technically superior to American Shermans. Japanese fighters might outperform American aircraft in individual categories, but technical superiority couldn't overcome the numerical inferiority of 3-to-1, 5-to-1, or 10-to-1. American workers understood this instinctively. Factory bulletin boards displayed production statistics comparing output to enemy nations. Posters emphasized that every tank, every aircraft, every ship represented American soldiers who would have equipment that enemies lacked. The message was clear. Production wasn't abstract. It was survival for American forces fighting overseas with equipment American workers manufactured. The psychological impact on workers was significant. Factory absenteeism, a chronic problem during peacetime production, declined dramatically after Pearl Harbor. Workers understood that missing shifts meant delayed production, which meant American forces fighting without adequate equipment. Productivity per worker increased as workers voluntarily extended effort, working faster and more precisely to maximize output. But productivity gains weren't just voluntary effort. Management implemented systematic improvements that multiplied worker effectiveness. Time and motion studies identified inefficient processes. Factory layouts were redesigned to minimize material handling time. Tool improvements reduced task completion time. Quality control systems prevented defective work from advancing through production lines. Willow Run exemplified these improvements. When the facility opened in 1942, producing one B-24 bomber required approximately 300,000 worker hours. By 1944, through continuous process improvement, the same aircraft required approximately 18,000 worker hours, a 17-fold productivity improvement achieved without changing the basic product. The improvements came from better tools, improved factory layout, more efficient work sequences, and worker experience accumulated through repetition. The facility itself was a marvel of industrial planning. The main assembly building stretched 1 mile long, containing 47 acres of factory floor. Raw aluminum entered one end, completed bombers exited the other. The production flow was continuous. Fuselage sections, wings, engines, and systems moved along parallel assembly lines, converging at final assembly, where complete aircraft were assembled in hours rather than weeks. At peak production, Willow Run produced one complete B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. The aircraft emerged from the factory, taxied to a runway adjacent to the building, and took off to delivery to military bases. The cycle was relentless. Raw materials in, finished bombers out, 24 hours daily, 7 days weekly. German intelligence monitoring American production initially dismissed the reported numbers as propaganda. Claims that single factories could produce bombers hourly seemed impossible. German aircraft factories, using traditional manufacturing methods with skilled craftsmen, required months to produce comparable aircraft. The idea that Americans could achieve production rates orders of magnitude higher using semi-skilled workers violated everything German engineering culture believed about manufacturing. But reconnaissance photographs confirmed the reports. German intelligence agencies obtained images of Willow Run showing rows of completed bombers awaiting delivery. The photographs were analyzed repeatedly, searching for evidence of deception. None was found. The Americans were actually producing bombers at rates German planners had concluded were impossible. The strategic implications were devastating. If American industry could produce heavy bombers at rates exceeding 1,000 monthly, while German factories produced fewer than 300, attrition warfare became unwinnable for Germany. American bomber losses could be replaced within weeks. German aircraft losses required months to replace. The mathematics of industrial attrition favored the side with superior production capacity. Japanese planners reached similar conclusions. Intelligence reports from America documenting Liberty ship production, cargo vessels manufactured in an average of 42 days from keel laying to launch, contradicted everything Japanese naval architects understood about shipbuilding. Traditional shipbuilding required years from keel to launch. American shipyards achieved the same results in weeks through prefabrication, modular construction, and assembly line techniques borrowed from automotive manufacturing. The strategic implication was that American merchant shipping capacity would increase faster than Japanese submarines could sink vessels. Every American cargo ship sunk could be replaced within weeks. Japanese submarines, once lost, required months or years to replace. The mathematics again favored American industrial capacity. But production statistics don't capture the human experience of industrial mobilization. For workers like Rose Monroe, factory work meant 12-hour shifts, 6 days weekly, performing the same operations hundreds of times daily. Rivet installation, position the gun, verify alignment, pull trigger, verify rivet integrity, repeat, for hours without variation. The work was physically demanding, mentally monotonous, and performed in factory environments that were noisy, poorly ventilated, and dangerous. Industrial accidents were common. Workers lost fingers in stamping presses, suffered burns from welding equipment, and experienced respiratory problems from chemical exposure. The work was not heroic or glamorous. It was difficult, repetitive labor performed under conditions that would be considered unacceptable in peacetime. Yet workers persisted because they understood the alternative. German and Japanese victories meant American casualties, potential occupation, and loss of freedoms Americans considered fundamental. Factory work, however difficult, was preferable to surrender or defeat. The psychological framework was defensive rather than aggressive. Americans were fighting to preserve their way of life, not to conquer foreign territory. This defensive motivation sustained industrial mobilization through years of sacrifice. Workers accepted wage controls, limiting earnings below what market conditions would have supported. Rationing restricted access to consumer goods, automobiles, and housing. Women entered industrial workforces in unprecedented numbers, performing jobs traditionally reserved for men and managing household responsibilities simultaneously. The sacrifices were real and sustained. The government supported mobilization through propaganda, emphasizing individual contribution to collective victory. The Rosie the Riveter campaign, inspired partially by Rose Monroe's work at Willow Run, portrayed factory work as a patriotic duty equivalent to military service. The message was that every worker was a soldier in the industrial war, that their contribution mattered, and that victory depended on sustained effort. The strategy worked because it was true. American industrial production determined whether Allied forces had adequate equipment to fight effectively. British forces relied heavily on American-manufactured aircraft, vehicles, and weapons supplied through Lend-Lease. Soviet forces received thousands of American trucks, aircraft, and locomotives that sustained offensives against Germany. American forces deployed equipment manufactured in quantities that overwhelmed Axis production. The D-Day invasion demonstrated American industrial capacity's strategic impact. American factories supplied the majority of landing craft, vehicles, aircraft, and supplies that enabled the Normandy invasion. German forces defending France faced opponents equipped with material advantages German industry couldn't match. More tanks, more aircraft, more artillery, more ammunition than German defenders could counter. The industrial advantage extended beyond equipment quantity to the quality of life for soldiers. American forces received regular supplies of food, clothing, medical care, and mail from home because American logistics capacity could sustain supply lines across oceans. German forces on the Eastern Front experienced chronic shortages because German industrial capacity couldn't manufacture both weapons and consumer goods in adequate quantities. The material conditions of American soldiers, better food, warmer clothing, more reliable equipment, reflected industrial capacity devoted to supporting forces overseas. Post-war strategic bombing surveys quantified American production's impact. German military production, despite strategic bombing, increased through 1944, but German production growth was slower than it would have been without bombing, and critically, German production never approached American production levels. In 1944, the peak German military production year, Germany manufactured approximately 40,000 military aircraft. American factories produced 96,000 aircraft the same year. The production differential meant that even without strategic bombing to reduce German output, American industrial capacity would have ensured numerical superiority. Strategic bombing accelerated the timeline, but didn't fundamentally change the outcome. American production capacity was overwhelming German capacity regardless of tactical factors. The human cost of sustaining this production was significant. Industrial accidents killed approximately 37,000 American factory workers during the war years, more than American combat deaths in the Pacific Theater through 1943. Workers sacrificed health, time with families, and in many cases lives to sustain production rates that a strategic victory required. Rose Monroe exemplified these sacrifices. She worked 12-hour shifts while raising 2 daughters as a single parent. Childcare was limited, family support networks were strained by mobilization, and the work itself was exhausting. Yet she and millions like her persisted because the alternative, inadequate production leading to American defeat, was unacceptable. The doctrinal lesson was that industrial capacity was as important as military strategy. Brilliant tactics couldn't overcome material disadvantage. German tactical excellence on the Eastern Front couldn't defeat Soviet forces equipped with American trucks and supplies. Japanese naval expertise couldn't overcome American shipbuilding capacity that replaced losses faster than Japanese forces could inflict them. The side with superior industrial capacity could accept tactical defeats, absorb strategic setbacks, and continue operations because production replaced losses. The side with inferior industrial capacity faced cumulative attrition that eventually exhausted available resources regardless of tactical skill. Modern military doctrine recognizes industrial capacity as foundational to sustained operations. Force structure planning assumes the industrial base can sustain combat consumption rates. Logistics doctrines emphasize supply chain resilience. Strategic planning incorporates industrial capacity as a critical factor determining sustainable operational tempo. These concepts trace directly to World War II, where American industrial capacity determined Allied victory as decisively as any battlefield campaign. The factories that Rose Monroe worked in, the assembly lines she served, and the bombers she helped build represented the decisive weapon, not because bombers were technically superior, but because American industry could produce them in quantities Axis forces couldn't match. In industrial museums today, riveting guns and assembly line equipment sit preserved as artifacts of wartime production. Museum placards describe production statistics, factory dimensions, and worker populations. Visitors learned that Willow Run produced 8,685 B-24 bombers, that American factories employed millions of workers, and that production output exceeded Axis capacity substantially. What placards often don't explain is that victory was achieved by ordinary workers performing unglamorous tasks under difficult conditions, sustained by understanding that their contribution mattered. Rose Monroe didn't defeat the Axis through heroic action. She defeated the Axis by installing rivets correctly, quickly, and repeatedly for years, until American production overwhelmed Axis resistance. The factory worker who helped defeat the Axis without firing a shot proved that wars are won in factories as much as on battlefields. Production capacity determines sustainable operational tempo. Industrial mobilization determines whether forces have adequate equipment, and ordinary workers performing specialized tasks on assembly lines can be as decisive as soldiers performing heroic actions in combat. 79 years after Willow Run's peak production, the principle remains valid. Conflicts are won by nations that can sustain the production of weapons, ammunition, and supplies faster than their enemies can destroy them. Tactical excellence matters. Strategic brilliance matters. But industrial capacity ultimately determines which side can sustain operations until the other side exhausts available resources. They didn't give Rose Monroe medals for her service. They didn't write songs celebrating rivet installation. They didn't build monuments to factory workers who sustained production through personal sacrifice. But without those workers, without that production, without the industrial mobilization they represented, Allied victory was impossible. The quiet weapon that overwhelmed the Axis was machines, discipline, and relentless output. The capacity to manufacture war material faster than enemies could use it, to replace losses faster than enemies could inflict them, and to sustain operations longer than enemies could resist. The American factory worker who never fired a shot helped defeat the Axis by making the shots others fired possible, by ensuring American forces had equipment enemies lacked, and by proving that democracy could mobilize industry as effectively as any dictatorship. Sometimes the decisive weapon is the one that doesn't fire. Sometimes victory comes from assembly lines rather than battle lines, and sometimes the heroes are ordinary workers who showed up, did difficult work, and sustained effort until the job was finished. The factories won the war. The workers made it possible. And the lesson persists. Industrial capacity determines which side can fight longest, which ultimately determines which side wins.